Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest of our presentations hosted by Clyde Co with Menas. My name is Andrew Grant. I'm a partner here at Clyde Co, and I head up our political risk team here. The meat of the talk today is over to Bijan, and Noel from Menas will introduce him. I have the job just because there are a number of faces who I don't know and may not know Clyde & Co. of really just telling you, and if you've been here before, is where Clyde & Co. have planted a flag in the sand again in our global campaign to take over the world. We are a truly international law firm. We mirror our clients and what they do in the insurance, trade and energy, oil sectors, in shipping and marine, and we've really expanded around the globe with them. Given the talk today on Iran, the closest I've got to Tehran is Ben Affleck's Argo, and I've not been there, but we are very big in the Middle East, particularly in Dubai, where we've been for the last 35 years. We went there when it was really a little creek with a few dhows floating up and down, and we've grown up with Dubai and have expanded into Abu Dhabi, Doha, and Riyadh, and now into India. We've got 1,400 lawyers around the world, 280 partners, and we are in 33 different offices. That number keeps changing. I'm not sure that exactly is accurate. In recent times, we're the first Western law firm to plant a flag in the sand in Libya, and we are driving an awful lot of work as Libya seeks to reconstruct and grow, particularly on focusing on its energy and infrastructure and international trade and projects as Libya grows. We also are in disputes, and no doubt we are and will be chasing Gaddafi's money around the world to try and find it for Libya. We're also in Tanzania, and again that is focusing on infrastructure projects, commercial, corporate, energy, oil, and so on. And our most recent two openings, and that's why I say the 33 offices may actually be incorrect, is we've just recently opened in Atlanta. Now that's more of an insurance play. But we are on the East Coast in New York and in New Jersey, and on the West Coast in San Francisco. And we've just opened in Atlanta. And I'm pleased to announce our latest opening. We're now in Madrid, where we will be expanding and using that as a platform into Latin America. Anyway, that's enough of the sales pitch from me. I'm very pleased to have Bijan, and I'll hand over to Noel to introduce the topic for today.
Thanks. Good morning. Welcome to this latest briefing by Menas. For those who don't know Menas, there's a slide here showing what we do. I won't go into any detail, but we have a publication side which is monthly and quarterly, focuses on a number of Middle Eastern countries, and then a whole series of weekly and fortnightly reports, which we call political and security reports. On the other part of Menas is a consultancy company which, although it began in the Middle East, is now operates in many parts of the world, and in recent years, very particularly in Africa. One of our main publications for many years has been Iran's Strategic Focus, and in fact, Menas, Bijan has edited it since 1995. It just shows how long it has been going. Bijan himself has worked with Menas with Menas for many years. He's a senior associate these days, based in Vienna, where he operates as an international strategy consultant. And he's commented on Iranian political and economic matters at many conferences and in many forums. He was based in Iran until 2 years ago and is now in Vienna. Without further ado, I'll ask Bijan to talk about Iran's outlook post-Ahmadinejad. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noel. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back, and it's also obviously a very interesting time to talk about Iran. Obviously, this is our outgoing president, as you see here, and now we are talking about what's emerging in Iran now that he's out. What I will do today is really to talk about the phenomenon of the Rouhani election on the 14th of June, which obviously surprised many inside and outside the country. This was the first presidential election since the 2009 elections that were disputed and which led to street protests and the consolidation of a new type of opposition in Iran called the Green Movement. And just as one of the first interesting facts about the new election in Iran is the fact that the Green Movement is still alive, because it was the Green Movement, in my view, that actually contributed to the Rouhani factor. I will show that in a few minutes. Obviously, this election and the emergence of a person who is clearly a contrast to Ahmadinejad, on many levels, in terms of international orientation, in terms of approach to Iranian politics, in terms of being a cleric versus a non-cleric. This is a contrast to Ahmadinejad, and it will have, this election and the emergence of a different government will have consequences. The questions that I will try to discuss is, one, to analyze what happened. How did Rouhani win? How can we explain this? And then the second important question is, why did the conservatives, the hardliners, no matter how we want to call them, they call themselves the principalists, how did it come that they decided not to rig this election? Because we know they rigged the election 4 years ago. What changed? Just discuss Rouhani. Who is he? What can we say about him, and what can we expect from his government? And then obviously one of the critical questions, what's the outlook for the nuclear negotiation? Because the nuclear negotiations are determinant in many processes in Iran, foreign relations, domestic relations, economic development, and so on. In Iran, sometimes some things are very symbolic. And just as a first hint that this election was not about to be rigged is a look at the ballot boxes. 4 years ago, they were not see-through. This year, they suddenly became see-through. These are small points, but they actually play a role in how they approach elections. And it was more difficult, considering all the checks and balances and the supervision, to change the contents of these see-through boxes at the end of the process, like they probably did 4 years ago. But let's move into the actual developments. The mainstream analysis on Iran was that the post-2009 clampdown, and especially the harassment and arrests and house arrest of the Green Movement leaders had created an atmosphere that the regime wanted to maintain, basically an exclusion of the reformist forces in the Iranian society and Iranian politics. And interestingly, about 3-4 months before the election, the conservatives started talking about engineering the election. It actually became a key topic. They said this election will be an engineered election. And no one knew what that meant. Engineer it in what sense? A rigged election, a staged election, or did they mean engineered in terms of some of the key candidates will be rejected? So this was the feeling that the conservatives will just produce their own candidate. And again, the mainstream analysis was the candidate of the conservatives is Mr. Saeed Jalili, the nuclear negotiator, and it was a foregone conclusion he's going to win the election one way or the other. What happened was, or where it started to, look differently, was when former President Mr. Rafsanjani, one of the architects of the Islamic Republic, actually was rejected as a candidate. He decided last minute to run for president, which is allowed, even though he was president twice before, because it was not consecutive. He could have run for president. He registered last minute and then was rejected. And retrospectively, you can say this was the biggest mistake of the conservatives or the hardline forces in Iran. Because what they did was they mobilized social and political forces against themselves by rejecting, by sort of marginalizing a critical figure like Rafsanjani. They compelled many forces to come out and to support either Rafsanjani or whoever Rafsanjani would put his weight behind. And I think that is what changed the dynamics. The maneuvering of Rafsanjani and another former president, Mr. Khatami, and how they put their weight behind Rouhani in the final days of the campaigning was very critical. And I will show you what that actually meant in terms of voter participation and how it changed the dynamics. This is the two presidents consulting about what they were going to do. As I said, their biggest mistake, the hardliners' biggest mistake, was to reject Rafsanjani. And what happened at that moment was that Khamenei, the supreme leader, who probably was comfortable with what happened in 2009, which was a very truly, if you want to use their word, engineered election, he had a choice. He had a choice to either follow the path that actually rejected Rafsanjani and would have probably worked towards a different outcome of this election. And it's not always through direct rigging. It's also through, manipulation of a few percentage points and then putting the election into a second round and then changing the dynamics in the second round. The choice was to either go down that route, but then Khamenei would have had a new green movement, probably a dark green movement after this election, this time led by Rafsanjani, not by a former prime minister or nobody in the greater scheme of the Islamic Republic, but this time led by one of the architects of the Islamic Republic. Or he had to just say, like he did last second, just count the votes. Let's see what the people want. And I think he made the right choice. Today, obviously, there are no new conspiracy theories saying he conspired that from the beginning. He wanted Rouhani to be the president. And I don't think so. I think Khamenei would have lived with any outcome of this election. But obviously, this was the outcome that the popular element, the popular sentiment also wanted. Just a quick look at the candidates we had after the vetting process of the different candidates. And when you read in the news, there were 657 candidates and most of them were rejected. Well, I think we would have rejected 620 of them anyhow. I mean, most of them were not serious contenders, but about 35 of them were serious contenders. They were former prime ministers, former ministers, former deputy ministers. So about 22 real political figures who could have run, including Rafsanjani himself, were rejected. But 8 remained. These were the 8. The 3 mainstream conservative figures who actually had created a coalition together: former Foreign Minister Ali Akbar Velayati, former Parliament Speaker Haddad Adel, and current Mayor of Tehran, Ghalibaf. These were the 3 who actually built a coalition called the 2+1 coalition. I call them the Khamenei candidates. They were the people who were closest to Khamenei. Haddad Adel is even related to Khamenei. Velayati is a advisor on foreign policy to Khamenei, and the mayor of Tehran comes from the same province, has a very close links to the Khamenei fact. And I think obviously we can't get into Khamenei's head, but I think Khamenei himself would have wanted one of these 3 to be the next president. Haddad Adel, the middle guy here, withdrew just a few days before the election. And what was interesting, and in my view one of the mistakes of this coalition, was they did not abide by their own agreement. They had agreed that only one of them will remain in the race. The one with the higher popularity would remain in the race. That would have been Ghalibaf, but Velayati did not withdraw. And that upset a lot of people who probably would have voted for Ghalibaf and Velayati, but they realized if they can't even keep their own word, how are they going to serve the people later? Then we had what I call the hardline candidate, Saeed Jalili, current nuclear negotiator, a relative a relatively young and unknown figure within the greater establishment of the Islamic Republic, but he emerged because he was a loyal servant of the revolutionary cause, of the revolutionary discourse. He was talking about, revolutionary ideological ideas. And just to say one word about what kind of personality he is, his PhD thesis, and he really has a PhD, and it is always disputed, was about the foreign policy of the Prophet Muhammad. So he really wanted to show that even Prophet Muhammad had a foreign policy, and we can be inspired by that foreign policy. So everything for these guys is really within the ideological framework of Islam, and then is the Islamic Revolution. Then we had two moderate reformist candidates. Mr. Rouhani himself, a former nuclear negotiator, a long-term member of the Supreme National Security Council. In fact, he's probably the only member of the Supreme National Security Council who has been a member since its inception in 1989. And he has been the representative of the supreme leader on that council. And for 16 years, he was the secretary of that council. He was really dismissed by Ahmadinejad when Ahmadinejad became president in 2005. And former Vice President Arif. Now, Arif also withdrew three days before the election. And he withdrew within a reformist, you can say, green movement campaign to put all their weight behind Rouhani. And I can tell you, this actually impressed a segment of the Iranian people. For the first time, someone who could have theoretically won the election, theoretically, withdrew and showed that he's not thirsty for power. He's there to serve a greater political cause, which was pushing back the hardline element, pushing back the Ahmadinejad Jalili factor in Iranian elections. So I think that was his withdrawal was a big step in securing Rouhani's success. Then we had two independent candidates, former commander of the Revolutionary Guards, Mohsen Rezai. This was his third attempt to become the Iranian president, and I've heard from people that he said, I will keep running until I become president. So expect him in 4 years, and then in 8 years. He's still, I think, young, and he can run again. But he's an interesting person. He's an ethnic Arab, which is probably one factor what attracts some people to him, but also another factor that cannot make him a national leader. An ethnic Arab has this downside in Iran. But an interesting person, potentially a member of the future cabinet. I will come back to that. This guy could re-emerge as a minister. And Mohammad Gharazi, who got about 1% of the vote, so he was, and he said it in the campaign, he said, I'm not running to win, I'm running to just introduce, because he said this is a good time, you get a lot of free TV time. And it's true, when you run for president and you get approved, you can actually appear on TV and show yourself and make a name. So it's from here on, we really don't have to look at Gharazi. Gharazi is an older guy. I don't see him playing a major role in Iranian politics. But this was the scene the Iranian people were facing, and this was the eventual distribution of the vote. 51% to Rouhani. The closest contender, Mr. Ghalibaf, the mayor of Tehran, with 17%. Jalili, this is interesting. The hardline rhetoric that has dominated Iranian foreign policy, especially Iranian nuclear negotiations, only got 11% of the vote. And this is very telling, because this will have an impact on the internal debate about the nuclear issue, about foreign policy, about international positioning. And I'm sure Rouhani and others will use this 11% figure in some of the debates to say, well, your approach is not very popular. Your approach that has led to tensions and sanctions and so on is not very popular. Rezai, Velayati, small players, but still important. So a first round victory for Hassan Rouhani. Now, if you want to understand what happened, we have to try to analyze how we can understand the Iranian society. But I will start with two layers of analysis. One is the regime itself. This is my analysis, not based on scientific academic research, but this is based on decades of analyzing the Iranian regime. I think the current composition of power and the sizes of these oval shapes represent relative power. So the most dominant power right now in Iran is the hardline conservatives on regime level. We are not looking at society, we're looking at regime. Are the hardline conservatives, led by Mr. Khamenei himself, and controls most of the levers of power, is obviously also led by the supreme leader himself. Then we have what I call the hardline techno-nationalists. Nationalists who insist on Iran becoming a major technological power. This sort of old revolutionary ideal of Iran becoming a regional power and a national power. These are the guys who push for, sending, satellites into the orbit and, investing a lot in new technologies, but then using that technology and that relative progress to push forward a nationalistic discourse in Iran. And I would call Ahmadinejad and also Jalili members of that kind of a thinking. So revolutionary ideal, but still with a notion of nationalism, not a notion of religious ideology. On the other side, still mainstream, we have the so-called Larijani brothers. These are the Ali Larijani currently is the parliament speaker. Sadiq Larijani, his brother, is the head of the judiciary. So two of the three branches of power are actually controlled by these forces. I call them the mainstream conservatives. They are closer to the reformists, to the moderate sector. And I would say in the lineup that we had, it wouldn't be very far-fetched to believe that some of the members of this mainstream conservatives actually leaned more towards Rouhani than any other candidate. So it's a significant element in Iranian power. Then the centrists, led by Rafsanjani and also Rouhani, these are mainstream forces leaning towards reform ideas, leaning away from the hardline thinking. And then a smaller element, weakened obviously through the post-2009 events, the reformists, Khatami, the leaders who are on the house arrest, Mousavi, Karoubi, and so on. This is, you can say, the key constituencies within the regime. And then we have two overarching forces. One is the clergy. It's a mistake to believe that the senior clergy in Iran is only conservative. We also have senior clerics who are very reformist-minded, who have supported Khatami and Mousavi and will now support Rouhani very clearly. So they are fragmented across the political spectrum, and also the Revolutionary Guards. Again, it's a mistake to believe the Revolutionary Guards only side with the hardliners. It's not true. The Revolutionary Guards, some of the leading critics of Ahmadinejad were actually senior members of the Revolutionary Guards. Someone like Hossein Alai, someone like Mohammad Nouriza. These are all people who emerged from within the Revolutionary Guards, leaning more towards the reformist ideas or the centrist ideas. So again, these two factors are, overarching over the whole sector. But how about the society? And I have to say here, a number of the analysts outside Iran, they fail to analyze the Iranian society. They think the regime is everything, if what the regime wants happens, and so on. Well, this election showed the regime is not everything. If you just look at the regime composition, it cannot produce Rouhani. This constellation of power would have probably produced Ghalibaf as a president, or would have preferred to produce Jalili as a president, because you see a dominance of the hardline factor. But the society is a player, maybe a restricted player, but a player. This is, again, based on my analysis and years of analysis of different election results, different developments. In Iran, I would say you have a 20% genuine support for the regime. These are mainly rural population, people close to the besieged forces, the militia forces, to the mosques, more religious elements of society, and they would genuinely vote for whoever they think is a regime candidate. And you can see that in every election. In '97, they voted for Nater Nouri. You know, in 2005, they voted for Ahmadinejad. They considered him the regime element, the regime candidate. Then we have a lower income class. I would put the figure at 35% of the Iranian society, who obviously have very clear economic interests. They would probably, you know, be attracted to the person who talks more about economic issues, and it's not always in line with regime ideas. For example, if you look, the last genuine election in Iran was the 2005 election. In the first round, the two people who got the vote from the lower income classes were Ahmadinejad for his populist discourse, and then Mehdi Karoubi, because Mehdi Karoubi said, if I become president, I will give a monthly cash of $50 to every Iranian individual, which Ahmadinejad hijacked later with the cash subsidies. And he got 5 million votes. Karoubi, just for the statement that I will give direct cash handouts, because it was something that attracted the lower income classes. Then on the other side, we have pro-reform forces. Again, based on different election results, mobilization factors, I would say it's at least 25% of the society, very interested, engaged in political matters, but clearly in favor of change, clearly in favor of a different political constellation, a different discourse in Iran. And then we have about 20% non-voters. And these are people who completely are completely disengaged from politics, or those who feel that they are not represented. They are not represented by the candidates that the Islamic Republic produces, hence usually don't participate in elections. Interestingly, in 2009, the regime managed to attract some of even these people. The 85% voter participation in 2009 actually brought some of these people to the political equation, and you hear them. There are people who say, we never voted in the Islamic Republic, but we voted in 2009 because we felt this is different, and then obviously we know what happened afterwards. Now, if you translate all of this into voter groups, this is how it would look. So we have a 20% support for the regime. In terms of voters, we had a total of 50 million voters this year, eligible voters. So that would be 10 million. About 30%, I would say, these are people who are proponents of change, whether they're in the lower income classes or middle class. They want to remain engaged. They don't want to dismiss the process of elections. They want to remain engaged, but they want change, especially the youth. They would go for a candidate, or they would act in a way that they feel that it could change. There are the other 30%, the green segment, are those who feel that they are not represented. And before 2005, there were actually genuine opinion polls, very scientific opinion polls, and this was confirmed. There were about 30% of the electorate who felt the parties present in the Islamic Republic do not represent their ideas and their aspirations. And as I said, the 20% non-voters. If we now put the election result, and these figures are based, the percentages that you see are based on the total of eligible voters. So let's start with the easier ones, the 30% non-voters. This is the 7% who didn't vote, and 3% of void ballots. We had, and it happens a lot. A lot of Iranians go to the polls and just write Obama on their ballot, or they write Gugush and other things. I mean, this happens. I've heard that from people who have counted votes. So that's easy. 20%, and 10% from the green segment did not vote, or just wrote nonsense on their ballots. That was easy. The other easy part is Jalili. Jalili's votes came from the 20%. So about half of the people in this group were people who felt Jalili is their representative, and Jalili is the regime guy. He managed to present himself as a regime guy. Now, some of those guys actually voted for Ghalibaf. They felt that Ghalibaf is the regime guy. He's close to Khamenei. He has been around for 16 years in high positions. He's mayor of Tehran. And a much smaller segment believe that Ghalibaf is that person. Velayati is that person. Again, someone experienced. He has been around since the beginning of the revolutions, close to Khamenei and so on. This was also easy. Now, to decide who voted up there, and to what extent, this is now a bit of speculation. But I believe Ghalibaf managed to attract some of these, especially younger voters. Actually, when you take the vote in larger cities, in the 5 to 7 large cities in Iran, Ghalibaf is not that far behind Rouhani. In Tehran, where Ghalibaf has been mayor for 7 years, Ghalibaf was, I think, at 30%, and Rouhani was at 40% of the total vote. So Ghalibaf managed to attract some of the middle class, urban population of Iran, and that was important. Some of these guys actually voted for Mohsen Rezai. Mohsen Rezai offered a different discourse. He has been a critique of Ahmadinejad. He has offered, and Mohsen Rezai very intelligently offered a program which he called the program of economic federalism. He said we will create federal structures for economic management. So all the economic management issues will be made on provincial level. And that was very intelligent. And interestingly, when you look at provincial results, after Rouhani, who won most of the provinces, the second person is Rezai. He won 4 provinces, especially the provinces with the as an Arab population and the sort of ethnic groups, Bakhtiaris and so on. It's a very interesting dynamics, despite his low vote, but he was influential in shaping some of the behavior. Some of these votes obviously went to Rouhani, but the success factor, and this is the critical element, if you want to understand why Rouhani won in the first round, it is because he managed, or with the support of Rafsanjani and Khatami, he managed to get a significant amount of the votes from the green segment of the Iranian population. People who under normal circumstances probably would have not voted because they were upset at the 2009 election results, they were upset at the rejection of Rafsanjani, they were upset at the arrest of the green movement leaders, but they decided to vote and they went and voted for Rouhani. Now, without that vote, imagine only the lower 50% would have participated in the election. It would have gone into a second round with Rouhani and Ghalibaf, and it would have not been far-fetched to believe that Ghalibaf could have won the second round. So what made the difference was that segment. And that is where I say that Green movement is still alive, and the Green movement is still capable of mobilizing. They mobilized a significant segment which changed the dynamics. Out of the 37% that Rouhani got, probably half of it came from that group. And that, I think, is very significant. I've said most of the issues, but just as an analysis, first of all, elections in Iran are unpredictable. And I heard someone here in the UK just last week said he has continuously gotten the elections wrong since 1997. And that's true. You know, you cannot predict elections, election results. The reason is elections are more than elections in Iran. Elections are the one opportunity you get in 4 years to participate politically. For 4 years, you are restricted. You cannot be part of a political movement. You cannot be part of a social movement. You're restricted, and there are lots of bans and arrests and harassments. But then suddenly, every 4 years, for a period of 2 weeks, everything is allowed. There is live televised debate where, if you hear different opinions, there is opportunity to go and demonstrate. You can campaign for your favorite candidate. And in those 2 weeks, all these sentiments, all these emotions, all this drive to participate politically come out. And then all of them are transferred to the ballot paper. So what was communicated, in my view, the political voice was that the Iranians wanted an end to mismanagement and corruption. This is one of the negative phenomena of 8 years of Ahmadinejad. Last year, when the news emerged that there was an embezzlement case in Bank Melli of $3 billion, $3 billion is a lot of money. It's how many jobs you can create with that money and so on. When these news came out, just this week, it came out that the government, the Ahmadinejad government, has inappropriately used $9 billion of oil money. These are news that the people hate, and they voted against this type of management of the economy. The people wanted to return to more moderate policies. I remember 8 years ago, a lot of people, when Ahmadinejad was being elected, a lot of people said in Iran, it doesn't really matter who is the president. The supreme leader is there anyhow, and the higher levels of power they control basically everything. Then came Ahmadinejad, and people realized, well, it does make a difference who is the president, because when you compare Khatami and the Khatami years with the Ahmadinejad years, you realize, well, it does make a difference. So a return to that, and that's why the support of Rafsanjani and Khatami for Rouhani were very critical. The desire to improve the economy, but also the international relations. I believe the critical moment in Rouhani's campaign was a moment live on TV where he was actually directly engaging Ghalibaf about a clampdown on students in 1999. And Rouhani, in a very interesting tone, said, Mr. Ghalibaf, I'm a jurist, I'm not a colonel. You know, he distanced himself from the sort of military thinking, the clampdown thinking. He said, I know how to, make laws. I know how to, develop ideas and so on. So this also created a lot of positive sentiment. This notion of here is someone who can manage the economy, who can manage international relations in a different manner. And no more experiments. Ahmadinejad, unfortunately, definitely in 2005, was an experiment for a lot of Iranians. I remember a lot of Iranians were saying, we have had so many clerics in power, let's see how a non-cleric will manage the economy. Some of them were even saying, some of the people who voted for Ahmadinejad in 2005, they were saying, let him come and that would be the end chapter of the Islamic Republic and the regime will collapse. And they were ready to experiment. They were ready to take on new ideas. This mood is not there anymore. People don't want to experiment. They want someone who can manage the Iranian government and who has a track record, and I think that's important. In any case, I believe Rouhani's election has the potential of pushing Iran back into a completely different mode, a more reformist, moderate framework. But who is he? Rouhani has been a first-generation cleric of the Iranian revolution. This is important because it actually legitimizes you. Rouhani was a student of Khomeini, of the first leader of the Iran revolution. Here he is before the revolution, behind Khomeini, and it's a very, very important. Rouhani, even though he's a few years younger, he can say, I was there the same way Khamenei was there, the same way Rafsanjani was there. I was there. I was a student of Khomeini. I was there from day -1. And one of his claims is that he was the first person who used the term imam for Khomeini before the revolution. It's like these are, within certain circles, these are legitimizing factors. So he was around from day -1 before the revolution. Rouhani also studied law at Tehran University. I always say that. I said that also when Khatami was elected. The most exceptional Iranian clerics are those who also studied at university. So they did not just study at the theological school and become a mullah. They also went to the university, especially the pre-revolutionary university, where obviously there was a much more liberal approach to university studies. So he studied law, he became a lawyer, and that helped him understand, let's say, the world and issues in a different way. Again, talking about PhD thesis, I told you about Saeed Jalili's. Rouhani's PhD thesis was there is always flexibility. There could always be flexibility in Islamic law. There is no Islamic law that cannot be changed. This is interesting. So he has produced, has thought about how can laws be changed, what kind of arguments are needed, and so on. Apart from being a cleric, which obviously connects him to part of the power structure in Iran, Rouhani was also appointed by actually Khamenei himself. Khamenei, in the 80s, he was, in 81, he became Iran's president. And in that role, he was also directing the war effort during the Iran-Iraq war. And he appointed Rouhani, Khamenei appointed Rouhani as a member of the war committee. So he was one of the leaders of the war. And here's a picture from that period when he's sitting with Rafsanjani. Rafsanjani and Rouhani were both members of that committee managing the war. And that gave him the opportunity to establish a relationship with the military leaders of Iran, the military commanders, Revolutionary Guards commanders, especially from the 80s during the war effort. And that is also important. If you want to manage Iranian politics, you need relationships with all these different elements. Between 1989 and 2005, he was the Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, and in that role between 2003 and 2005, he actually led Iran's nuclear negotiations, back then mainly only with the Europeans. And it was, regularly, almost every month, there were meetings between Rouhani, between former Foreign Secretary Jack Straw, between Joschka Fischer, whom you see in this picture. The three European negotiating states were continuously in touch with Rouhani, and to be honest, if you talk to the diplomats today, they're very nostalgic about that era, because they say that was an era where, it made more sense. There was much more of a logic in the negotiations, and Rouhani, to be fair to him, was the person who managed to get the agreement in the Iranian power structure to suspend enrichment for 2 years as a confidence-building measure. One of the most significant factors shaping Rouhani today has been the fact that he has led the think tank called the Center for Strategic Research in Iran since 1995. And in this think tank, he has brought together, especially after 2005, most of the former ministers, former deputy ministers, a lot of former parliamentarians who were marginalized as a result of the Ahmadinejad years, came to that center and continued to think about Iranian issues. In a way, the closest phenomenon that we have to a shadow government has been sitting in the Center for Strategic Research. And it's interesting because exactly these guys will actually be key members of the next government. I will show some of them in a minute. Mr. Nobacht, who led the economic division in that center, will probably be the next Minister of Economy in Iran. Mr. Vaezi, who led the international relations division, will be the next foreign minister. So it's, in a way, the exposure of Rouhani to academia, to think tanks, to international think tanks, and a lot of debates. He has been a conservative member of the Conservative Society of the Combatant Clergy. Just to be clear, he's part of the conservative clergy. And it's interesting that in 1997, he actually sided with Nater Nouri, with Khatami's conservative rival, with the guy who actually was the regime candidate back then. But obviously, in the meantime, especially because of what Ahmadinejad has done in Iranian politics, even Rouhani is considered a reformist moderate. So it's like there has been a shift to the right, hence the more centrist guys have become moderate. And you see that he's very close to Khatami. Khatami and Rafsanjani declared their support for him, and I think that's very important. So what can he do? Obviously, he has to deal with a number of power centers who oppose him. The Iranian parliament is still overwhelmingly conservative, hardline. The supreme leader, we know, is not necessarily on the same wavelength on a number of issues. But in Iran, there is always a popular momentum. If you win an election the way Rouhani won it, or the way Khatami won it in 1997, you have a grace period. You have a period of about probably 1 year to prove that you can do things differently, that you can actually put this popularity momentum into good results. So he will use this momentum. You can already feel it. You know, for example, some of the political prisoners have been released over the past few days, either released or sent on leave, which wasn't happening before. So you can see the hardliners themselves are sort of creating some space because they feel they only have 11% of the popular vote. So they cannot really say that they are the dominant figure. And Rouhani can rely on this vast network of Rafsanjani, of Khatami, and others. The critical element for any president in Iran is the ability to, drive a multi-layered bargaining process with diverse interest groups. You have the clergy, you have the Revolutionary Guards, you have the merchant community, you have intellectuals, artists, and so on. And Rouhani, because of what I just showed you, he's a cleric. He has the legitimacy of being a first-generation cleric, a pupil of Khomeini. He has had dealings with the military leaders. And because of the Center for Strategic Research, he has had dealings with intellectuals, with academia, and so on. So he has the ability to engage all of these things. So what could he potentially do? He's already talking about building a government of national reconciliation. In a very interesting statement, he said he will probably invite all his rivals to join the next government. I don't know if he will invite Jalili, but I think he will invite everyone else, including Rezai. He has already offered a position to Ghalibaf, who will make Aref, who withdrew in favor of him, the first vice president. And there is talk, I will come back to that he will appoint Mr. Velayati as the chief nuclear negotiator. That would be an interesting dynamics because you have an experienced person who is close to Khamenei. So the national reconciliation factor will be strong. He could improve the management of the economy by reversing some of the ideas. And obviously, I will come back to that. He can change the approach to the nuclear negotiations. He has a different style. He doesn't have a confrontational style like Jalili has. He's more pragmatic, and he could, if he appoints the right people, change the dynamics. Reducing domestic tensions, in my view, the process has already started. And the most important factor, success factor for him could be if he manages to return some of the technocrats and diplomats who were completely marginalized by Ahmadinejad back to power. And one of the interesting facts there is these guys, former ministers from the Khatami era, for example, not only they have the experience as former ministers, they also have 8 years of experience of being outside the government, which is also important in Iran. Some of them joined the private sector, some of them joined universities, but they felt how government actions can actually hit the non-government, and this can help them come up with some new ideas. However, all these changes will require time, and especially in the nuclear negotiations, Rouhani will very much depend on some sort of goodwill from Washington and Brussels. I mean, he can change the dynamics inside Iran, but if tomorrow we have another set of sanctions from the US Congress, it will ruin all the goodwill that Khatami can introduce. What can he do in the nuclear standoff? What I've produced here is probably the layers that influence nuclear and sort of national security decisions in Iran. You have at the center core, the core element is the Supreme Leader's office, the Supreme Leader himself, and the immediate layer around him are the military organizations, the Ministry of Information, but most importantly, the Supreme National Security Council. In fact, most of the key decisions are made with the Supreme National Security Council together with Khamenei present. Now, the president, by virtue of his post, is the president of the National Security Council, the Supreme National Security Council. So here he has a voice. I mean, he cannot be determinant, but he can change the debate. He can offer new perspectives. Then there is the expediency, the next layer, expediency council, the government, the president. Obviously, here again, he can change the dynamics. And if he manages to convince Velayati that he should play the role of the secretary of the National Security Council, then he has created a very significant bridge between the leader's office, because Velayati is part of the leader's office. He's the foreign policy advisor of the supreme leader, and this National Security Council. And he also will be able to manage one of the key obstacles in Iran, and that is always the obstacle of, okay, if there is a nuclear deal, imagine there is a nuclear deal tomorrow. The big question in Iran is, who will get credit for it? Is it Khamenei? Is it the president? Is it the nuclear negotiator? But if it's someone like Velayati, who is an extension of Khamenei, and who obviously has been appointed in that position as secretary by the president, it would be a collective success, collective responsibility. So I do believe he can change the dynamics. He was the nuclear negotiator for 2 years, so he has some degree of credibility outside Iran. And what it needs now is some degree of creative diplomacy. There are some plans. He has already referred to an agreement that Iran reached with the Europeans in 2005, which was then rejected by the Americans. Obviously, facts on the ground have changed, but the principal idea is, okay, one of the two sides has to make a first step. And how do we do it that there is no loss of credibility? And that's why you need more capable, more creative, more experienced diplomats. Key challenges. Rouhani's biggest challenge, in my view, will be, first of all, to satisfy the expectations of the Iranian people. This election and all the excitement around it have already created big expectations. The people think that a Rouhani government will manage the economy, but these things cannot be, changed and reversed overnight. So down the line, there will be some disappointment. He has to manage the economic bottlenecks. I will come back to the economy in a minute. Fighting corruption and mismanagement. It's one thing, obviously, to have cleaner people at the top, better, more capable managers, but there are lots of layers of government officials, provincial governors, mayors, and so on, who have been corrupt and will be corrupt, and it's not easy to undo that so quickly. And to induce some confidence into the business community. Now, the good news is that his election has already created some positive momentum in the business community. I will show you the reversal of the free market rate for the Iranian rial is an indication. In foreign policy, obviously, to navigate through the very complex power structure and come up with some creative solutions. As I said, he's only one voice, and this voice, initially he will have to use the momentum, the popular momentum, to do some things. To secure some sanctions relief, and also to attract the needed investment and technology. Iran, as a result of sanctions, is lacking technology, investment. A lot of opportunities are suffering as a result of the current situation, and these will be his main challenges. Rouhani and the Iranian economy, I wanted to show you just in the week after his election, the blue line here is the free market rate for the Iranian rial. It's not an illegal, it's not a black market rate, because actually as an official rate, hard currency dealers, foreign exchange bureaus can actually use this rate. The rial has appreciated by about 20% in 1 week. And that is a vote of confidence from the business community, because most of the people, determinant in this factor are the business community. And I don't think it will go much lower, because I think 30,000 rial to the US dollar is a real value of the Iranian rial, considering everything. And the so-called currency exchange rate that you see, the red line that the government has introduced, is a managed rate, is a rate that can only be managed within a limited market. The biggest asset for Rouhani is the fact that he's extremely close to the president of the Iran Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Nahawandian, and there is talk of Mr. Nahawandian becoming the next Minister of Industry and Trade. And if that happens, it will generate a very, very positive feeling among the private sector players, and private sector will be the key for job creation, for economic growth in Iran, because Ahmadinejad has upset the private sector, has introduced a new form of nepotism in politics, which Rouhani has to reverse. So the principal factors are positive. However, when you look at some of the economic indicators, especially the red ones, first of all, GDP per capita in Iran is declining. It has declined, obviously partly because of the currency devaluation over the past couple of years, but also because of all the factors that we discussed: sanctions, mismanagement, subsidy reforms, and so on. Inflation is high. Even official inflation is close to 30%, and unemployment. Now, Rouhani has declared as one of his goals to make the Iranian unemployment rate 1 digit. This is what Ahmadinejad also promised 8 years ago, but it's extremely difficult. Iran has a very young demography, but he has to start reversing it. Khatami in his government managed to produce an unemployment of 10%, and it's possible to reverse the current trends, especially by getting the private sector more engaged in investments, in job creation, and so on. Very quickly, because there is obviously a lot of interest in the oil sector, very quickly, the petroleum sector in Iran obviously lacks investment and appropriate technologies. The subsidy reforms that were introduced in December 2010 have generated some savings, but the cash upside, the one idea of the subsidy reforms was cash upside, has been mainly spent on cash handouts. So it was more of a political decision rather than an economic decision. There will be some medium to longer term gains, but the fact is production has declined. It's now about 3.1 million barrels per day, as opposed to 4.2 million barrels a day 2-3 years ago. IOCs are absent because of the sanctions situation, and more contracts are going to the Iranian companies. So you have a lot of Iranian prime contractors, but there are limitations because of the technology sanctions, financial sanctions, banking sanctions, and the sector has been in a decision paralysis as a result of the elections, and now everyone will wait for the new minister. But the fact that potentially some of the industry veterans, former deputy ministers, will come back to this industry will be positive. Quickly, some key figures. I mentioned a couple of them. First Vice President Aref, this is good news. He has already done this job 4 years ago. The first Vice President is really the manager, the day-to-day manager of the government. Aref was the Vice President under Khatami. The talk in the Ministry of Petroleum was of former Minister Bijan Namdar Zangane. I personally believe Mr. Ne'matzadeh, who headed the petrochemical company of Iran, is more likely to be the next minister, but this is all open anyhow. I mean, there will be a lot of give and take in this process. I mentioned Nobacht is a very intelligent guy, very, very interesting, very knowledgeable person. He would be good for the Iranian economy. Mohammad Nahawandian, the current president of the Chamber of Commerce. Velayati, I mentioned. Mahmoud Waizi, a former deputy foreign minister, again, interesting, experienced diplomat as foreign minister. And the biggest coup, if he manages to do that, if he brings back Mr. Nater Nouri as the Minister of Interior, a very experienced guy, very close to the core of the establishment, he could be very influential in easing some of the social tensions and reforming some of the laws. So very quickly, as I said, Rouhani's election has the potential of reversing some of the negative developments. I believe Iran is moving towards a more pragmatic set of policies. There will be a popular mandate, a popular momentum. and his main focus will be on the economy, but sanctions, relief, or new impetus to nuclear negotiations is also part of the economic equation. You know, you need to secure some sanctions relief. It's very clear when you look at the composition of his government that he is pushing back some of the forces who gained power under Ahmadinejad, especially the Revolutionary Guards. There is no doubt that these forces, these centers will push back. It's not that, you know, just Rouhani will push them back, but they will also hit back down the line, maybe in 1 or 2 years. So Iran will return to factional infighting. It's not going to remain calm for too long because there are just competing interests. The most interesting appointment would be the appointment of Velayati as nuclear negotiator. If this happens, we can expect some movement, some new ideas in the nuclear negotiations. And regional issues such as Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq could serve as areas where Rouhani could build confidence. In his first press conference, he referred to the Syria issue twice as saying the Syrian issue is an issue of the Syrian people. He did not mention Bashar Assad. He did not say this is a, you know, we insist on Bashar Assad surviving. He said whatever the Syrian people decide. So it could be a new discourse. Thank you very much. This is all I have prepared, but I look forward to your comments and questions.
Are there any questions for Bijan? Yes.
My name is Masoud Janaka. It's a very interesting talk. Thank you very much. One of the things that more cynical observers have talked about Ahmadinejad was the fact that this democratic dictatorship that they've set up, pre-selected candidates for actually suited emergence of people like Ahmadinejad. And President Khatami in his period tried to change some of this, especially the whole Velayat al-Faqih abandonment. But the question I had is that what measures do you think Rouhani could put in place to stop another Ahmadinejad emerging? And have you seen the back of Ahmadinejad, given the support he had from the Russians?
First of all, Ahmadinejad, I have no doubt, will prepare to run in 2017. And because he's a former president, unless he is charged with some clear corruption cases, which is not impossible. There are a number of files, especially corruption in private sector or privatization, that could actually completely marginalize Ahmadinejad and his future political perspective. But you know, Iran actually, in a very funny way, discussed a new election law over the past year. An election law that was even passed by the parliament was then rejected by the Guardian Council because it was put together in a hasty way. I think if the first term of Rouhani goes back to that election law and tries to come up with a realistic structure within the Iranian power structure to change the way elections are managed and find practical ways of reducing the impact of the Guardian Council. For example, in that election law, they were saying people who have the signatures of 100 recognized politicians cannot be rejected. This is one way of doing it, you know, to say, well, if that would have been the case in this election, Rafsanjani could have not been rejected. There would have been 1,000 people who would have signed that, you know, this guy is good to run for president. So you can create structures. You cannot change the constitution, the overall powers of the constitution, but you can start introducing institutions or logics or narratives that can reduce the impact of the more reactionary elements of the political structure. I can see that happen. I don't know whether this is a priority for Rouhani right now, but it's definitely possible, especially if he does it in that first year where he has a momentum and where he can say, well, I got 51% of the popular vote. People like my ideas, and we are going to do it this way. But I am afraid it could also be forgotten because there are so many other priorities, economy, foreign policy, that he may not attend to this.
you look back, what happened in Iran is not that dissimilar to what happens in the West too. For example, you have hardliners like Ahmadinejad and Jalili who win the argument and do what they want. And on the other side, in the West, we had really an opportunity for a win-win grand bargain when Khatami was power, and it didn't happen. Because we have similar people like Richard Bolton and Benjamin Netanyahu, for example, who perhaps represent a minority globally, but they managed to succeed. They managed to block. Is the West, do you think, going to learn anything from this, to use this as an opportunity?
I am not as optimistic on Western initiatives as I am on Rouhani's possibility to inject some new momentum into the nuclear negotiations. I think the biggest spoiler will be the US Congress. I think the US Congress has its own logic, its own dynamics. There is no a crazy analysis in Washington that says it was actually the sanctions that produced Rouhani, and then so we have to just put more sanctions on Iran to produce more moderate sort of voices and forces coming out of Iran. There is a very naive analysis of Iran in Washington, and then there are obviously all these other interests. You mentioned Israel and obviously other regional issues, and it has become just easy to antagonize Iran, or it's too expensive politically to do something in favor of engagement with Iran and so on. So I think one of the biggest spoilers could be the U.S. Congress. The one fact or phenomenon that will push against this is the growing realization that Iran is an important player in a number of the crises, whether you take Syria or Afghanistan, situation in Iraq, security in the region, fighting Al-Qaeda. So maybe there will be forces who will say this is the opportunity to engage Iran. And the last time we achieved something extraordinary, which was pushing back the Taliban, was when Iran and the US worked together. So there will be voices, but there will also be spoilers, and we just have to wait and see what happens. As I said, I'm optimistic that a Rouhani Velayati nuclear negotiating team could push the agenda and change the dynamics, but I'm not as optimistic about Washington, unfortunately. Yes, please.
Ian Lamb, London Corporate Training. Obviously, it'll be some time before it'll be possible for people in Tehran or in Iran to get visas to come to this country. On the other hand, are you able to shed any light on the possibilities or difficulties for us to send management trainers to Iran?
I don't have any numbers, but I mean, obviously it's become more difficult to get visas, but it's not impossible, and a lot of Iranians are actually coming here. And apart from that, there are hundreds of thousands of Iranians who now have 2 passports and they travel internationally without worrying about visas. But getting British trainers to Iran under the still current administration, my advice would be not to select British passport holders, because there is still this conspiracy mind about Britain's role in sort of trying to influence the political developments in Iran. But the Rouhani government, especially if a number of these experienced ministers, diplomats come back, they will have a completely different outlook. I mean, just to use the historical parallel, in 1997, when Khatami was elected Iran's president, the UK and Iran did not have ambassadorial relations. There was remember the Salman Rushdie case, which was undermining relations. And within a year of Khatami's election, that was all managed, and the countries exchanged ambassadors. So I expect a similar momentum, but obviously a lot will also depend on the dynamics of the nuclear negotiations, on the sanctions issue. But this type of a thinking that is emerging with Rouhani is more at ease with relations with Western countries, as opposed to the Ahmadinejad, Jalili type of thinking.
slightly surprised that you only mentioned Syria at the end. I mean, I only know what I read in the papers, which characterize it as becoming a sectarian dispute between Sunni and Shia. How realistic is it to believe that Iran can actually pull back from that sort of situation? It seems to me to be more likely that it could make a movement there, which would encourage the West on the nuclear side. But is it feasible?
First of all, I mentioned Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq as geopolitical phenomena where Iran could show its goodwill and build confidence. What Iran could do in the Syria crisis is basically try to impose a new compromise solution on the Assad government.